I was struck by many things you said, particularly your emphasis on the dangers of sectarianism and parochialism, and your emphasis on the necessity of truth, not just as the words that we say, but also the actions that we take in our lives. One of the key lessons that I have learned and continue to learn from Mahatma Gandhi is the importance of aligning my actions with my values and not just saying something, but living it. That's a very easy thing to say and an incredibly hard thing to do, and it's something I think all of us have to continue to fight to do in our own lives. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be speaking with you all here. It's morning here in Pittsburgh. I know it's evening where most of you all are. It's a remarkable thing to be able to speak across such distance. Of course, as a historian, I have to say it's not entirely new to the world. People have been speaking across distances for a very long time, but never with quite so much speed. It's a wonderful thing to be able to see all of your faces and to communicate in this way. And because communication is really, I think, the essence of learning, I am going to try to keep my remarks as brief as possible so that we can have plenty of time for questions and for conversation. I look forward to sharing my thoughts with you, but I'm also very excited to hear from you all and to learn from you all. Thank you. All right, where to begin with Gandhi, truth, and integrity, particularly with an audience that we have here where I expect many of you are already quite familiar with the central importance of truth to Gandhi's life, to his philosophy, to his politics, to every facet of his life. The first thing I would say is that for many people in the world, particularly outside of India, I think in the United States and other parts of the world, Gandhi's not very strongly associated with truth. When we think of Gandhi in the United States and many other places, we think of nonviolence. We think of peace. We think of India's independence. But we don't think about truth. And I think that is a mistake for a variety of reasons. For one thing, I think it flattens our understanding of who Gandhi was as a political figure. It flattens our understanding of his nonviolence. Because for Gandhi, of course, and this is something I expect many of you are already very familiar with, nonviolence was not just a tactical means to create political change. It was that. It was a tactical means. But it was also very much a spiritual and philosophical pursuit of truth. And if we forget that, then we misunderstand Gandhi's approach to nonviolence. The other thing I think is lost is the remarkable degree to which Gandhi can speak to us in our current political moment, not just in regards to the use of nonviolent civil disobedience, which is obviously extremely important in our world, in our country right now. In this country, the Black Lives Matter protests are demonstrating the importance of nonviolent civil disobedience and the power of it. But Gandhi speaks far beyond that. And one of the things he speaks to is actually what Professor Sharma so eloquently gestured towards in his introduction. And that is the willingness and, in fact, the desire to continually learn across the boundaries of our lives. So for Gandhi, truth was not sectarian, it was not parochial, it was not limited to his own cultural, religious, national sphere. It was constantly about connecting across borders. He was always learning from others, and we see this in his biography very clearly. He was a remarkably cosmopolitan figure, which I think is a tremendous testament not just to him, but actually to India more generally. One of the things I often talk about with my students, both those who are of Indian descent and not, because it's important for everyone to think about this, is just that I think one of the great strengths of India as a place, as a culture, as a civilization, is that it's always been multiple. It's always been open to diversity, to ideas from outside, not accepting them on their own merits automatically, but judging them, analyzing them, engaging them. And Gandhi does this from his early days in India, through his time in the UK as a student, through the several decades he spends in South Africa. He's constantly integrating ideas from all parts of the world, deciding what to keep, what not to keep, and what to practice in his own life. Let me give you a few examples of where I see Gandhi's approach to truth being so important. And then I want to link it to the idea of integrity, which I think really pulls it all together for me. Okay, so the first thing I want to start with is actually I'm going to start right off with something very controversial in our moment today, and I expect some of you are familiar with this. In many parts of the world, in Ghana, in the UK, in the US, statues of Gandhi have been targeted by protesters who claim that Gandhi was a racist. This is something I expect many of you have encountered already and have had a chance to think about. But it saddens me tremendously. It saddens me tremendously because, in fact, there are many figures in our past, in the United States, in India, and other parts of the world, who were in fact racists and deserved to be questioned, interrogated in that regard. But Gandhi was not one of them. And the reason was precisely because he was able to change over time. If you look at Gandhi's first, let's say, 10 years that he was in South Africa, you find him making many statements that strike us all, I would say, as racist. But then something happens, something quite remarkable happens that is very rare, that many people never have happen in their life, and that is that Gandhi learns and he changes. He accepts that he was wrong to make the statements that he made in the past, and he becomes, from being someone that you could associate with racism, he goes all the way to the other extreme and becomes one of the most important champions of anti-racism in the world, and reaches out to Black South Africans, reaches out to African Americans, and speaks out against racism, not just in the context of British colonialism, but in many other parts of the world. This I see as, first of all, just very good evidence that Gandhi should not be targeted as a racist, because you shouldn't label someone for actions that they did early in their life and ignore the way in which they've changed over time. It's not fair to that individual. But it also misunderstands, I think, one of the most important lessons we can take from Gandhi, which is that the pursuit of truth is never ending. Someone who is seeking truth never gets to the point where they say, aha, I found it. Now I know the truth. I can just sit all day long and recite it. No, truth is a constant search. It's a constant process. And Gandhi knew that quite well. That's why, as noted in the introduction, his autobiography was called Experiments in Truth. It wasn't titled How I Found the Truth, How I Discovered the Truth. It was a process, a constant process of experimentation. All right, I gave you the example of race and his evolution in regards to race. Let me give you one more example, and then I want to bring in integrity. And this is an example that might seem quite small, but I think it's actually quite revealing, and that's Gandhi's relationship with salt. I expect all of you know about the Salt March and the centrality of his protest against salt tax to his 1930 campaign. What many people don't know is that salt enters Gandhi's mind, his thoughts, within the context of his diet. It doesn't start as a political question. It starts as a question of his own relationship to his diet. And for many years, he experiments with what he calls his salt-free or saltless diet. It's not exactly salt-free because, as he knows well, salt comes with many of the foods he eats, his vegetables, his milk, etc. But he tries to not add any additional salt to his diet because he sees it as better for his physical well-being, and also because he sees salt as making food too flavorful and thus tempting him to become hedonistic, tempting him away from the spiritual path that he's on. His approach to food is very much steeped in the Jain and Hindu traditions that he takes from his mother and from his family in the Gujarat of his youth. But it's also very much bound up with his connection to vegetarians and vegetarian activists in the UK and elsewhere. But what's remarkable about salt is that, just like race, he changes his mind. Over time, he becomes convinced that, in fact, he's being too strict by trying to eliminate all additional forms of salt, that it doesn't need to be cut out entirely, and that, in fact, it might be healthier for him to add a little bit of salt to his food. He moderates over time. And so what we see by the time he launches the salt Satyagraha is that he's already gone from an extreme position on salt to one where he's more aware of salt's nutritional value and its importance to the diet, and that actually helps drive his interest in opposing the salt tax. So he links his own personal struggles with salt to the political struggles against the salt tax. All right, so I've given you two examples here. One very much from his political world, the example of racism. The other that spans his personal and political worlds, the example of salt. They're both examples of Gandhi changing his mind over time. And I would submit, if you look at his life, if you look at gender, if you look at caste, if you look at class, you find a man who's constantly evolving, who's constantly changing. And he might not change as much as we want on some of these issues. In fact, I would suggest that he doesn't change enough in how he looks at caste and how he looks at gender. But he changes more than most historical figures do. He changes more than most of us are able to do. And that, I think, is a testament to his approach to truth. And it's also a testament to what I see as his integrity. And here's where I'll conclude, friends, and open up to questions. There are many ways to understand integrity. But I think when it comes to Gandhi's life, we have to think about it in at least two different realms, and at least two different lenses. One is the way in which the different ideas that he espoused cohered, that they internally cohered. So, as I said at the outset, you can't understand, for example, his views on nonviolence without understanding his views on truth. And both his ideas of nonviolence and truth are related to his conception of love, for example, or his conception of freedom, for example, Swaraj. The different ideas in his life connected, and he connected them. He actively worked to make the different facets of his philosophy and of his politics cohere. That's one facet of his integrity. But the other facet of his integrity that I think is equally important returns us to what Professor Sharma said in the outset, which is that for Gandhi, ultimately what matters is not what you believe in your head, and it's not what you say with your mouth. What matters is how you live your life. And that's not just about your small individual acts of daily life, those matter. It's also about how involved you are in fighting for justice in your own communities, in your nation, and across the world. What are you doing with your days? What are you doing with your time? What are you doing with your money in order to try to make the world a better place? For Gandhi, that's the key question. It's not just what you think or what you say, it's what you do. And it's that form of integrity that I think helps him continually change over time. When you really sit down and think, and I actually try to do this often, it's not an easy thing to do, but when you sit down and you actively think, what are my key values? What do I care the most about? And am I living in accord with those values? I submit that most of us, myself included, will find discrepancies. We'll find ways in which we're not fully living up to our values. And in that process, we see opportunities to change. And I submit that that's how Gandhi evolves over time. That's what allows him to change so much when most historical figures get stuck in ice, right? And they aren't able to continually evolve and change. Look at someone like, for example, Winston Churchill, just as an example, who's often held up as a hero. If you look at Winston Churchill, his views on race and empire basically stay the same his whole life. He was a white supremacist all the way through his life. And he doesn't change that much. Whereas someone like Gandhi changes dramatically. And I think he does so because he's constantly interrogating his own life and trying to live a life of truth and a life of integrity. I'm going to pause there, friends. As I said at the outset, I'm a big fan of conversation. And so I would welcome any and all questions and also thoughts and ideas. And I look forward to learning from you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Slate. I open this forum for discussion. If there are any questions, you may please ask Professor Slate directly, or else you can post it in the chat box and I shall put those questions to you. Naveen sir, you are unaudible. Please unmute yourself.
I am saying anybody can ask directly to Professor Slate. They need not to come through you. If they want, they unmute themselves and ask.
Yes.
And meantime, you continue searching. If there are any question in chat box, you may ask. There are any question in chat box?
There is one question. It's a bit unrelated, but I will post it after some time. I'd like to ask Professor Slate a question regarding Satyagraha. We all know that the Gandhian way of Satyagraha has been very instrumental in getting India's independence. But what was the essential principle behind Satyagraha? Was it non-violence or was it truth?
In that case, I think the answer is both. I don't think you can boil it down to one or the other. Of course, the word itself, as most of you know, draws from the word for truth, right? And so obviously Gandhi himself saw it as intimately bound up with truth. But I don't think he would distinguish between truth and nonviolence. He saw them as intimately bound together. And I would add that the success of Satyagraha in gaining India's independence, while obviously significant, strikes me as in some ways less important than the way the process of Satyagraha created opportunities to continually push to bring India to its full potential. Let me say that in a different way. How do we understand India's freedom? Well, you can say India gained its freedom in August 1947, right? And you could say the same thing, the United States gained its freedom when we won the Revolutionary War against the British, right? But in the context of the United States, it's obviously not true, because at the time of the Revolutionary War, 20% of the United States were enslaved people that had been forcibly taken from Africa. What did the Revolutionary War mean to their sense of freedom? What did it mean to women who could not vote? So in the context of the United States, it's very obvious that freedom wasn't achieved at the moment that our country became independent. It's an ongoing process, one that people have continued to fight for and die for over time and are still fighting to do. I think the United States is still not as free as we should be. In the case of India, of course, at the moment of independence, India was vastly more free than the United States was when it became free. And I give credit to India's founding figures who, for example, extended universal suffrage at the moment of India's independence, right? Regardless of caste or class or gender. But as we all know, India also continues to have many limitations to freedom that are standing between the India that is and the India that should be. And I would say, Dr. Singh, that when we think about Satyagraha, we can't just think about the past. We have to think about the future. And we have to think about how can these techniques be used to continually fight to redeem our democracies, both in India and the United States, and make them live up to their full potential.
Thank you, sir. We have one question from Dr. Abhimanyu Prasad. He says, we all know Gandhian philosophy is still prevailing in our society, but do you have any idea why he was not honored with Nobel Peace Prize?
That's a wonderful question. Well, one thing I will say is that Gandhi, like most historical figures who fought for radical change, another great example is Dr. Martin Luther King, are vastly more popular in retrospect than they were at the time. People who are fighting to change the world in fundamental ways are very rarely popular, particularly amongst those that are in positions of power and privilege. So Dr. King, for example, was a very controversial figure at the moment he was killed, and it was only decades later that most Americans came to see him as a heroic figure. Gandhi, of course, at the moment that he was killed, was already incredibly popular within India. But on the global scale, particularly in Europe, there were many white Europeans that saw him like as Winston Churchill saw him, right, as a troublesome lawyer who was causing trouble and difficulty. So I think part of the reason he wasn't honored with the Nobel Award, and I think that obviously is it's a dishonor to the Nobel Award, of course, right? I mean, Gandhi's one of the few figures in history who, if you give him an award, you're not honoring him, you're honoring the award, right? So it's really it's their loss. But I think what it tells us is actually very important, and that is that if you're going to fight for radical change in the world, you shouldn't expect for those in power to welcome that or to acclaim you during your lifetime. Right? Many of the most important historical figures are people who were profoundly controversial in their time, and it's only many decades later that we're able to look back and everyone rally around them, sometimes by misinterpreting their legacy. And I think this is true of both Gandhi and Dr. King, is that people they can appropriate their image and their icon and forget just what they stood for. I think that's something we all have to fight back against, to say we shouldn't just honor them in name, we should really think about what they cared for and fight for that too.
We have a very... Yes, sir. Rakesh sir, you can go ahead, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Professor Slate, there is one curiosity. Very recently there was Bhumi Pujan regarding Ram Mandir. Gandhi was proponent of Gandhi had believed in he had been propagating always regarding Ram Rajya. During his lifetime, there was controversy against Ram Rajya raised by Dr. Ambedkar. Both Gandhi and Ambedkar both are held at very high esteem in US. So, what's your idea about Gandhi's Ram Rajya? Had he been here at the moment, had he been favored this Ram Mandir, etc.?
Thank you for asking that question.
Are you getting it?
Yes.
Yes.
It's not question, it's curiosity.
Oh, sure. No. Well, I appreciate I appreciate it very much, and I also appreciate the way that you brought Dr. Ambedkar in as well. Often, because Dr. Ambedkar was very critical of Gandhi, as I'm sure you all know, it's easy for us to pit the two figures against each other, to see them as opponents. But I think that there's many good historians have demonstrated that although they disagreed on many important questions, there was also many ways in which they worked together, in which they respected each other, and also many ways in which we can learn from both historical figures. And one of the things I find quite striking about both historical figures is that both men, particularly towards the end of his life in the case of Dr. Ambedkar, they both found great meaning in religious traditions, right? For Gandhi understood himself very, very strongly as a Hindu. And Dr. Ambedkar, of course, towards the end of his life, became a very prominent Buddhist. And the question is, well, okay, what can we learn from that? I think one of the most important things we can learn is that both Dr. Ambedkar and Gandhi were tolerant and incredibly cosmopolitan in their views of religion and in their approach to religious questions. This comes back to what Professor Sharma said at the outset. Gandhi felt strongly that he could be very proud to be a Hindu and yet also learn from all other religious traditions, including Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism. And Dr. Ambedkar, similarly, was an incredibly cosmopolitan figure who had studied in many parts of the world, who learned from different legal traditions. And when he approaches Buddhism, one of the things that he admires about Buddhism is that Buddhism as a faith is an incredibly tolerant faith. It should be anyway. Of course, there are Buddhists in Sri Lanka or in Burma who are not as tolerant as we would like. But my own sense is that the essence of the faith, the essence of Buddhism, just like the essence of Hinduism, is one of openness and respect. And if I can offer just one personal anecdote from my own past, this is many years ago. It was my second time in India. I was a young man. And I was in Tamil Nadu, and I went into a very beautiful Shiva temple in Tamil Nadu, and I didn't know what I was allowed to do. What was I allowed to enter the temple? Was I not, as someone who's not Hindu? What could I do in the temple? And I went in out of a profound sense of humility and of openness to different religious traditions. And there was a priest there who strode up to me, and I didn't know what he was going to say to me. I thought he was going to tell me I have to leave. And instead, he came up and started to talk to me about the fundamental unity of all religious traditions and how happy he was to have me there and how open he was to have me there. Now, I know very well, as all of you know, that in the history of India, there's a long history of temples not being open to all people based on caste, for example.
Sir, may I interrupt here?
Yes, please.
Are you allowing me to interrupt? Actually, my curiosity was whether you find any meeting point in the current scenario among Gandhi, Ambedkar, and the current government of India, this Modi policy regarding this Ram Mandir, etc.
Yes. Oh, yes. No, I was getting there. Sorry, I was being very long-winded about it, but yes, I was getting there.
This was my curiosity.
I guess my view is the question is, well, what was the point in building a temple to Ram on that particular site? What was the goal in doing so? Was this about
consensus
Yes.
among Gandhi,
I guess my view is that the
and the
question
modern
that
law.
both Gandhi and Ambedkar would ask is, if we're going to construct a temple somewhere, is doing so an act of faith or is it an act of aggression? Right? If I build a temple on the site of a demolished mosque, it strikes me that there is an aggressive message built into that process, and there has to be. And what I would like, and this is very difficult to do all around the world, what I would like is to see ways to take a contested site like that site, and there are others in the world. Look at the Hagia Sophia in contemporary Turkey, right? This is a site that was at one point a mosque and then a church and has now been turned back into a mosque. My own view is, are there ways to use such sites to communicate a message of tolerance and openness and connection across different faiths, rather than pitting one community against another? And I think that's what Gandhi and Dr. Ambedkar would both want. Both men, again, particularly towards the end of Dr. Ambedkar's life, took great meaning in being men of faith, but they were also incredibly tolerant and believed very strongly in pluralism. And I think that's the question I would pose if I had the opportunity to speak to Prime Minister Modi. That would be the question I would ask. What's the goal here? Is there a way to create an opportunity to unite people rather than to divide them? Because our world already has enough division.
Thank you, Professor.
That's very insightful, sir. We have another question from one of our participants, Ashia Khatun. She wants to know Gandhi's idea about the freedom of women in terms of gender equality, and was it in sync with his principles of truth?
This is an outstanding question, and as I gestured earlier, I think gender is one of the facets of Gandhi's philosophy that, although he changes dramatically in a positive direction, I don't think he changes as far as many of us would like to see him go. There's been also some wonderful scholarship on this as well. There's an old, but I think still very powerful piece in the EPW, the Economic and Political Weekly, that it's called Gandhi on Women, that is incredibly detailed and looks at Gandhi's evolving views on women and gender more generally. The way I usually tell the story when I talk to my students is to give a lot of credit to the women who helped Gandhi to grow and change. And this is true in every facet of Gandhi's life. He doesn't make his changes alone. He is helped by others who push him. So look at a Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, for example, who is a very important, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, although outside of India, sadly, many people don't know that name. It's something I always try to change when I give talks, because she was such a remarkable human being. And one of the things that she did was really challenge Gandhi to rethink his views on the role of women in the movement. If you look, for example, at the Salt Satyagraha, many of you will be familiar, Gandhi chose to only bring men on the Salt March. Right, and he talked about why he did that, and it's a complicated thing for him. Part of it was his view of how it would be seen by the British and by outsiders if there were women on the march. He worried that it would be seen as a way of making it harder for the British to use force on the marchers. He didn't want to seem to be doing anything cowardly. But some of it also came from the fact that even at that point in his life, he still had very strongly gendered views on the right role for women. He wanted women to be in the movement, and he wrote a lot, as I'm sure many of you know, about the way in which nonviolence uniquely allowed women to participate in the struggle in a way that, say, a violent conflict might not. And yet he had a particular view for what women should do, primarily boycott liquor stores, for example, or in the case of Salt Satyagraha, to boycott those selling salt. But people like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay and many other women freedom fighters helped force him to develop a more egalitarian view of gender, so that by the end of his life, he is much more keen to bring women into positions of leadership and much more keen to envision a society in which men and women are truly equal.
Ankit wants to know, if Gandhi proposed the idea of non-violence, so why did he give the slogan of do or die?
That's a wonderful question. Gandhi was very clear that if the choice was between cowardly accepting injustice and violently resisting it, he would choose violence. He didn't see that as the choice. Happily, there is a nonviolent way to resist injustice. But too often, nonviolence is associated with what was often called in his day passive resistance, which is too easily seen as apathy. Right? It's too easily seen, oh, okay, you don't want to be violent, then you're just not going to do anything at all. And for Gandhi, the worst thing that you could do is to sit around and let injustice continue without trying to confront it. It would be better to confront it violently than not to confront it at all. The other thing I would say is that nonviolence, of course, is a path that often brings violence. It often creates violence, and that is a tension that many practitioners of nonviolence, including Gandhi, have struggled with. But the nonviolence is on the part of those who are practicing Satyagraha. It often pulls violence from those in power. It's often met with violence by those in power, and so someone who is going to practice nonviolence has to be willing to be beaten and has to be willing to die. And Gandhi was very aware of that. So when he says do or die, I think one of the things he's gesturing towards is to say we have to be willing to lose our lives for what we believe in, and he was, and he did. I mean, he has killed at the end of his life for the tolerance, for the interreligious respect and harmony that he believed in very strongly. He laid down his life for what he believed in. He made, in many ways, the ultimate sacrifice, and he's very aware that nonviolence doesn't mean peace. Its ultimate goal is peace. But to get there, you have to engage in conflict. Nonviolent satyagraha is a form of conflict that often elicits violence from those in power. And sadly, in our world today, that's still true. Again, look at the Black Lives Matter protests in this country. How did the police respond to those protests? With violence. Sadly, that's what those in power usually do. So anyway, thank you for that. It's a very good question, and it reminds us that nonviolence is often bound up with violence in very complicated ways.
Dr. Rajkishore seeks your opinion on how far Gandhian idea was affected with the American thinker John Ruskin's book Unto the Last.
Well, I would say that Gandhi draws ideas from many figures throughout the world. It's, I think, always important to avoid ascribing too much importance to one source. Many Americans, for example, like to suggest that Gandhi takes the idea of nonviolent civil disobedience from Henry David Thoreau, because there are a couple times in South Africa that Gandhi writes about Thoreau very approvingly, and certainly he's interested in Thoreau's approach to nonviolent civil disobedience. Ruskin is another figure that Gandhi is very interested in and draws from. Tolstoy, the great Russian pacifist, is another figure that Gandhi corresponds with and is interested in. But it would be a disservice to Gandhi to suggest that he pulls all of his ideas from any one of these figures. Rather, what he does, and this comes back to what I said earlier about truth and integrity, rather what he does is to actively take the parts he likes, to not take the other parts, and to pull their ideas together. In the case of Ruskin, a lot of what Gandhi is interested in is his views on technology and his views on the dignity of labor. As many of you know, Gandhi is very concerned about modern civilization and its over-reliance on technology. In fact, I don't know how he would feel about us all communicating in this way. My hope is he would like it. You know, he took to the radio. He used radio often. He used telegrams often. He was a journalist. It was one of his many vocations. So my hope is he would like this particular technology. But I'm sure he would have some concern about many ways in which the digital age is taking us away from the power of using our hands to create things. So my short answer is he does learn from Ruskin, as he learns from Thoreau, as he learns from Tolstoy, as he learns from many others. But he was a very independent thinker, and one whose ideas were a product of many different sources, including many Indian sources. It's very important to remember that. He was a cosmopolitan figure, but also one that took many very important ideas from indigenous Indian traditions.
Dr. Anil Kumar wants to know, how do you see the place of Gandhian ideals realized in profit-oriented market economy. He says it's kind of greed versus humanity.
This is a very good question. I just taught a course in which I had 24 students from all around the world, and one of the big things we debated was, can capitalism be humane? Maybe that's the best way to put it. Can capitalism be humane, or does it always drive us to become our worst selves, our greediest, most selfish selves? I guess I would like to imagine that we could create a social and economic system in which the best facets of our market economy, I'm thinking here, for example, of innovation, of competition, the things that in some ways are that we do best, and by we here I mean both India and the United States and all market-driven economies in the world. Could we hold on to those things but humanize them in a way that we are able to confront many of our most pressing problems, in a way that, for example, we could have a world where no one is desperately poor? I think it's a tragedy, and I'm sure Gandhi would. It's one of the biggest things he would confront right now. How is it possible that we live in a world where we have billionaires living in huge, fancy houses, and this is true in India, and it's true in the United States, and it's true elsewhere, and then have people without enough food to eat? And that's true in India and true in the United States. Here in Pittsburgh, there are many people, and many children, that don't have enough food to eat every day. How is that possible in such a wealthy country? So my short answer is I like to be a utopian thinker. I like to imagine ideal scenarios. I think it's a useful thing to dream. And I could imagine a scenario in which we have a market economy that is truly humane, one in which we have no poverty, one in which we don't have the same kind of glaring inequality that we have right now, one that calls us out to be our best selves, that calls us out to cooperate and to share and to work together, and not just to compete. But we certainly don't have that now. I think right now it is absolutely true that our economic systems often bring out the worst in us, and are perpetuating societies that are not living up to our best selves.
Dr. Vijay wants to know, do you see Gandhism or a Gandhian philosophy becoming Hinduism in the current Indian scenario?
Wow, that's a very big question. I would start by saying that for Gandhi, Gandhiism and Hinduism were fundamentally connected. So many of his ideas he drew from his own understanding and self-identity as a Hindu. But this comes back to the question earlier about the temple. For Gandhi, what it meant to be a good Hindu was to be incredibly tolerant and cosmopolitan, and to oppose any kind of of sectarianism, or violence against those of other religious beliefs. And I think, sadly, what we see in the world today, when we look at our greatest faiths, is that every major faith in the world, I would submit this, has many people within it who I would suggest have fundamentally lost the true essence of the faith, and are using the faith in order to attack others. This is certainly true of Christianity. There are many Christians in the world who are somehow amazingly forgetting that the true essence of Christianity was love and care for others. Right? I mean, Gandhi himself, I think, if I remember correctly, said at some point that he, what was it? Is something like, the problem with Christianity is that people. I'm going to forget the good. It was such a good quote. Maybe some of you will remember it. You can put it in the quote section. He said something about the Christians just needed to actually live like Christ. They needed to live in accord with their own values and principles. And I think he would say the same thing about Hinduism, the same thing about Islam, the same thing about Buddhism. Is that what we need is to remind people that the core essence of these faiths is about being a good human being, being respectful of others, being kind, being generous. That's how Gandhi understood Hinduism. So my short answer to this question is I think Gandhiism is Hinduism for Gandhi, but Gandhi would also say that Gandhiism can be Christianity, it can be Islam, it can be Buddhism, as long as whoever is practicing that faith is practicing it with a good heart and aiming to love others, to care for others, to be kind to others. That's the real essence. And I'll just say something for me personally. I have had the honor of meeting people from every major faith tradition, and from people that don't practice any faiths, from atheists, from others. The thing that strikes me that I hope my own children learn is that in the end of the day, to me, it doesn't matter what faith someone practices. What matters is, are you a kind human being? Are you caring for the sick and for the needy? Are you being good to your neighbor regardless of their faith? That's ultimately what matters. I think that's what mattered to Gandhi as well.
Yeah, we have one question from Dr. S.K. Raut. He's asking about the current scenario. What is the relevance of Gandhism for safety and security to human life in this critical situation of COVID-19?
Oh, that's another great question. Well, one thing we should remember is that Gandhi lived through a pandemic just as terrible and in many ways more terrible than the one we're all living through now. He lived through the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. And there is, in fact, some evidence that he might have suffered in that pandemic. It's unclear. He had come down with another illness just at the moment when the influenza pandemic was starting to spread through India. He was already sick at that moment, and then he got better, and then he got sick again right as the influenza virus started to spread through his ashram. And I took some time to actually go back and look at what he wrote and what he did in those moments in time. And one of the things that I was most struck by is that at his best, Gandhi is able to see in a crisis like this an opportunity for us to reflect on who we are as a society, who we are as a species, and to think about how we can come together and not just how we can be divided. When you think about COVID-19, the thing that strikes me most is that in some ways this is uniting the whole world. All of us are having to struggle with this, right? And to some countries more than others. The United States, sadly, is struggling tremendously right now with COVID-19. And it's an opportunity for us to forge connections and solidarities as we're all facing this common struggle. And yet some of our leaders, and again in the United States, our current president, are using COVID-19 as an opportunity to try to divide people, to try to create more divisions in the world. And sadly, authoritarian leaders often do that, right? They take these situations of crisis and try to use it to turn one group of people against another, to demonize others, to attack minorities, to attack those who are different. So I think what we all need to do, I think what we could learn from Gandhi is to say, no, this is a crisis that affects us all, that we're all impacted by, and we have to come together and work together within our communities, within our countries, and across national lines in order to attack this problem together.
Now we have last two questions to you, Professor Slate. One is, Supriya wants to know, did Gandhi kind of propagated the caste system by helping the backward and minorities more?
Well, I would say Gandhi's views on caste are among the trickiest of facets of his life and legacy. He does change dramatically in terms of how he views caste. So if you look at him early in life, he is opposed to untouchability, but strongly supportive of caste. He's opposed, for example, to intermarriage and to interdining. But that changes. By the end of his life, he goes so far as to say that he will only attend marriages that are intercaste. He becomes an advocate of interdining, and he becomes critical of the very idea of caste. So he evolves from being against untouchability, but in many ways for caste, to being very critical of caste as a hierarchical institution. But he remains patronizing in his views of how Dalits and India's indigenous communities and others who had historically been oppressed, he remains fairly patronizing in terms of his views of how those communities can and should fight for their own rights. This is one of the big differences between him and Dr. Ambedkar, right? Is that Dr. Ambedkar wants Dalits to have their own voice politically, whereas Gandhi wants to suggest that he himself could speak for Dalits because he cares for them so much. in our current political moment, in my own view, my own opinion, is that I think Dr. Ambedkar's approach there makes more sense. I think if you have an oppressed community, that community needs to be empowered, it needs to be given its own voice, it needs to be given its own leadership, and that even someone who's very well-meaning, but who is outside of that community, they can be supportive, they can be allies, but they can't and shouldn't try to assume total control. I see that I'm a white American who cares very strongly about racism in this country, and I want to fight against racism in this country. But that doesn't mean that I should believe that it's my job to lead black Americans in their struggle. No, black Americans are taking the lead in their struggle, as they should. And my job as a white American is to support them and be an ally for them. And I think Gandhi, even at the end of his life, was too patronizing in his views of how to attack caste. It's one of the things I think he should have learned more from. The other part of the question I think is a tricky one, and it's tricky in India and it's tricky in the US as well, is in our current moment, how do we attack injustice? How do we attack oppression, whether it's based on caste or race or class or gender or otherwise, in a way that doesn't contribute to more divisiveness? And this is a tricky issue. I don't think there's a simple answer to this. But I would say I reject the idea that when people advocate for the rights of Dalits or tribals or oppressed people, or in this country, fight for the rights of African Americans, I reject the idea that that itself is somehow a form of prejudice. Right? In this country, for example, there are some white people that say, well, we don't like Black Lives Matter. It should be all lives matter. When you say Black Lives Matter, you're being divisive. I don't think that's true. The analogy I've heard others say is, if my neighbor's house is on fire, right, and they call the fire department and they say, my house is on fire, I'm not going to go out on the street and say, well, why are you getting all this special attention? What are you getting? So I want some water on my house. No, my neighbor's house is on fire. They need to get the water to get their house not on fire anymore. And in the United States, African Americans are still being discriminated against. They should fight to say that their lives matter, right? And I would say the same thing in India, when people who have been historically oppressed are fighting for their rights. I don't think that has to be divisive. I think it can, in fact, help people come together to honestly confront those injustices and to fight together to oppose them.
The last question for today is from Dr. George Hockett. He wants to know, do you think Gandhian philosophy is still relevant today? Don't you think it to be utopian in the contemporary world?
It is utopian, but that's part of why it is useful. I agree with you. There are many facets of Gandhian philosophy, to go back to his views on technology, for example, that are hard to imagine being fully acted out in our current world. Are we really going to imagine a world without heavy industry, for example, or a world without the digital tools that we all use in our day-to-day lives? I don't think that's going to happen, at least anytime soon. And yet, to imagine that world, to imagine, for example, what would our world be like if we didn't have computers, if we didn't have the internet, can actually be incredibly important to us, because it can help us remember the importance of taking some time in our lives away from those technologies. There are now people that are paying lots and lots of money to go stay in hotels that don't have any internet access. Why? Because many people have become addicted to internet access. They spend all their time on their phones or their devices. I worry about this for my own children. I worry that they will become addicted. And I think Gandhi, one of the facets of Gandhian philosophy that actually is still incredibly relevant are his concerns about technology. I would suggest that every facet of his philosophy is still incredibly relevant, even those facets that might strike us as utopian, precisely because they help us imagine how we could live differently, how we could live better. I think, I still believe in a better world. I think we have to. I think we have to wake up every day and say to ourselves, the world is not what it should be. We have children that aren't getting enough food to eat. We have people fighting and killing each other because of the color of their skin, because of the word that they use for God. This is not how the world should be. We should envision a world in which there is no poverty, a world in which there is no war, a world in which there's no discrimination. And how do we get there? What can we do as individuals to fight to get there? And Gandhi's philosophy, I think, is absolutely essential to helping us think about how to move from the world that we're in now to the world we want to be in. It doesn't mean, though, that we should take everything he said and hold it up and say, well, that has to be true. He wouldn't want that. He would himself want us to approach him in the same way he approached all of the other historical figures he learned from. Our goal is to be critical, to take the parts of his life and legacy that we aspire to and use them, and to reject the parts that we think we should reject. And that itself is incredibly Gandhian, to come back to his approach to truth. We have to decide for ourselves what we're going to hold on to. But here's the real trick, friends. We have to live it. We can't just think it. We can't just say it. This is what Gandhi would most want us to do. We have to decide for ourselves, how can we live our values in our days? How can we live our values in our countries? How can we live our values across the whole world?